Hey, what's going on, developers? In this tutorial, we're going to implement the authentication in Nest.js with Passport library. In the first section, we're going to authenticate our users with username and password. And in the second section, we're going to protect our API endpoints with JWT access token. And in the last section, we're going to implement the refresh token functionality in our Nest.js app. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, I open up the previous video's project, but before moving forward, let me tell you that you should have some basic understanding on Nest.js framework. So if you're not familiar with the Nest.js, I highly recommend you to watch my previous video, which is a crash course on Nest.js. And by watching that video, you will have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of Nest.js. Okay, let's moving forward. So the first thing you want to do is to create an auth module. So in the terminal, I want to say nest.g module auth, and then create a service for this auth module. So I'm going to say nest.js auth -- no spec, because we don't want it to create a test unit for this service. And also we want to create a controller for this module. So I want to say nest.gco auth -- no spec. Okay, so if I go to the auth directory, you can see we have an auth module, auth service, and also auth controller. Okay, I go to the auth service, and here in this service, we're going to create an async function called validate user. So I'm going to say async validate user, and this function takes the username and password as its parameters, and then check if such a user is existed in our database. And if so, it just return the user, and if not, it just return null. So here we're going to have a username, which is going to be string, and also a password, which is going to be string as well. So first we have to check that if any user with this username is existed in our database. So we're going to do this with the help of a user service. So before doing that, let me inject the user service inside this service. So I'm going to create a constructor, and then inside it, we're going to have private with only user service, which its type is the type of user service class. Okay, and in the validate user function, we're going to say const user equals to await this user service, and then call the find one with username function, and then pass the username into it. So if I go to the user service, you can see we have a find one with username function, which takes the username as its parameter, and then use the user repository that find one function and find the first user in our database that its email is in match with the username parameter. So in this application, we consider the email of the user as their username. So let's go back to our auth service here, and after find one with username function, we check if the user is not null. So we're going to say if user, and if the password parameter is in match with the password of the user in our database, we just return the user, or otherwise we just return null. But since the passwords in our database are hashed, we can't compare the equality of the passwords with just this operator. We have to compare the passwords with the compare function of the bcrypt library. So before doing that, let me import the bcrypt. So I will say import star as bcrypt from bcrypt. And by the way, if you remember from our previous video, we installed the bcrypt library with npm I bcrypt. That's it. So let's go back to our validate user function and call the bcrypt.compare function, and then pass the password parameter and also user.password. So this compare function is an async, so we have to put an await before it. So we're going to put it inside the parentheses. So here we check if the user is not null, and also the password parameter and the user.password are the same, we return the user. But we don't want to return the user object with its password. So we're going to extract the password out of the user object. So we're going to say const an object and set it to user, and then back to the object, extract the password and then put the rest of the user object into a result object and then return the result. So the result object is our user object without the password property. And also if this condition is false, we just return null. So I'm going to say return null. So that's it with the validate user. With this validate user function, we take the username and password as its parameter and then check if such a user existed in our database. We just return that user without the password property, or else we just return null. And next, we're going to define the login function inside this auth service. But before doing that, we're going to install 3 packages. The first one is the Nest.js JWT, and since we're going to use the passport library in this project, we're going to install the passport JWT as well. So I'm going to say npm i-save at nest.js/JWT and also passport-JWT. And next, we're going to install the types for the passport JWT. So we're going to say npm i-save dev at types/passport JWT. Okay, let's close this off and define our next function inside the auth service, which is the logging function. So I'm going to say async login, and this logging function takes a user object and then creates a JWT access token for this user and then returns the user along with its access token into the client. So we're going to have a user which is type of our user entity, and then inside it we're going to create the JWT access token. And in order to create the JWT access token for the user, we're going to use the JWT service that comes from the Nest.js/JWT package that we just have installed. So first of all, we're going to inject the JWT service inside our constructor. So here in the constructor, I'm going to say private JWT service, which is going to be type of JWT service, which comes from the Nest.js/JWT. Okay, and then we go back to our login function. And here, in order to create a JWT access token, we should create a payload object. And then from this payload object, we're going to create a JWT access token. So first of all, I'm going to say const payload. It's going to be an object which has the username inside it, which is going to be user.email, and then a sub object which is going to have name, which is going to be user.name. And also here we can add another info about our user, but here we just want to keep it simple. So after that, we can return an object which contains our user. So I'm going to spread the user object, and then it contains an access token. So this access token is going to be created from this payload object. So here we're going to call the this.jwt service and then call the sign function and then pass the payload object. So we have an error, and that's because we forgot to close our curly braces here, and the error is gone. And also we should remove this curly braces here. So okay, we're good to go. And here, as you can see in the login function, we first create a payload object and then we return an object that contains our user and also an access token that is created from the payload object with the JWT service.sign function. Okay, and that's it for the auth service. But here, because we have used the user service and also JWT service inside the auth service, we have to register them inside the auth module. So here inside the providers list, I'm going to add the user service and also JWT service. And then inside the imports list of this module, we're going to register and configure the JWT module. So we're going to say JWT module, which comes from the Nest.js/JWT, and then call the register function and then pass an option object to it, which is going to have, first of all, the secret key, which we are going to read it from the env file. So I'm going to say process.env.jwt_secret. And then we're going to have a sign-in option, and it is going to be an object, and inside it we're going to specify the expire in property, which define the expire time of our JWT token. So I'm going to set it to 3600 seconds, which is going to be 1 hour. Okay, we're good to go now. Let's save this and we can now go ahead and create our env file and then put this JWT secret inside it. So I go to the root path of our project and create a env file. So I'm going to say .env, and inside it we're going to put a JWT secret variable, and it can be set to a key. For example, we're going to have a secret JWT and put a random number. So what is this JWT secret key? Well, it is used to sign and verify the JWT tokens. So when a JWT token is going to be signed, it is signed using this secret key, and the recipient of the JWT can then use the same secret key to verify the integrity of the token and ensure that it has not been tampered with. So it is really important to keep this secret key secure and not share it with anyone who should not have access to it, because having access to this secret key allows an attacker to create forged tokens that could be used to gain unauthorized access to our system. And that's why we didn't put it directly inside our TypeScript file, and instead we put it inside the env file. Okay, I hope this little explanation makes sense for you. Now I save this and close this env file, and now we can install the passport libraries. So I open up the terminal and here paste a script for installing the Nest.js/passport, passport itself, and also passport local. So we install these 3 libraries. Okay, and then I'm going to install the types for the passport local. Okay, and I close this off. And now we can go ahead and define our passport local strategy. So what is the passport local strategy? With passport local strategy, we can authenticate our users with username and password. So the users have to provide a username and password in order to log in into our system. So in order to define our passport strategy, I go to the auth directory, and inside it, I'm going to create a directory called strategies. And inside it, we're going to create a local-strategy.ts file. And in this file, we're going to export a class named local strategy and extend it from passport strategy, which comes from the Nest.js/passport, and then pass the strategy class, which comes from the passport local. So here, as you can see, we have 2 strategy class. The first one comes from the passport-JWT, and the second one comes from the passport-local. So here we import the strategy from the passport-local because our strategy is local. And then inside it, we're going to have a constructor, and then inside the constructor, we're going to inject the auth service, which is going to be the type of class auth service. And then inside the body of the constructor, we're going to call the super class. And then after the constructor, we're going to define the validate function. So it's a async function, async validate, and it's going to take a username, which is going to be a string, and also a password, which is going to be a string as well. And then inside it, we're going to call the validate user from the auth service that in the beginning of this video we just created. So let's go back to our local strategy file, and here we're going to say const user equals to wait this the auth service, and then call the validate user, and then pass the username and password to it. And then we check if the user is null. Then we throw a unauthorized exception that is come from the Next.js/common. So we're getting an error, and that's because we have to instantiate a new object from this unauthorized exception class. And then if the user is existed, we just return the user. And for the last thing, don't forget to mark this local strategy class with the injectable declarator from the Nest.js. And then we go to the auth module, and inside the providers list, we add the local strategy class. And then for the next step, we're going to create the local guard. So I go to the auth directory, and inside the auth directory, I'm going to create a directory called guards. And inside it, we're going to create a local-auth.guard.ts file. And here we just have to export a class named local auth guard. Actually, the name of this class is up to you, but I think the local auth guard is a good name for it. And then extend it from the auth guard function, which comes from the Nest.js/passport, and then pass the local string, which means that we are going to create a local guard here. And then just put a empty body for this class. And that's it. Okay, let's save this, and you will see the usage of the local auth guard class in a couple of minutes in this video. So now we can go ahead and create our login endpoint inside our auth controller. So here inside this auth controller, we're going to create a login API. So I'm going to create a post API, and let's import the post from the Nest.js/common, and then create an async function called login. And inside the parameters of the login, we're going to access to the request object, and we're going to do this with the request decorator that comes from the Nest.js/common, and let's call it rec. And then inside the login function, we're going to return await, and then call the login function from the auth service. So let's inject the auth service inside this controller. We now have a constructor, and then private auth service, which is going to be type of the auth service class. And then we can access to the auth service here. So we return this .auth service.login, and then pass the rec.user. Okay, and if I go to the login function inside the auth service, you can see it receive a user object, and then create a payload object from the user, and then just return the user object, and also create a access token using the JWT service, and then return this whole object to the client. And if I go back to the auth controller, you can see we extract the user from the request object and then pass it to the login, and it creates a access token from this user object. But before calling this login function, we have to authenticate the user. So in order to do that, we can just decorate this login function with the useGuard, which comes from the Nest.js/common, and then pass our local strategy guard. And that's it. Oops, I didn't specify the login route here. So when the post request come to the /auth/login, it first call the local strategy guard, and then the local strategy guard calls the local strategy, and then local strategy class calls the validate function inside it. Then the validate function calls the validate user from the auth service, and the validate user inside the auth service check if any user with this username and password exists in our database. It returns the user. So inside the local strategy, we have the user object that is returned from the validate user function of the auth service. If it is null, it means that the user is not authenticated, so we throw a unauthorized exception to the client. And if it's not null, it means that the user is authenticated, so we return the user object. And here, login function is called, and the user object returned by the local strategy class is captured within the request object. And then we return the request.user into the login function of the auth service, and then it creates an object which consists of the user object and also an access token, which is a JWT token that is signed with the data of the authenticated user. And then it returns this object to the client. So let's save the controller. And before testing this login API inside the Insomnia, let's create a register API so we can create a user. So we're going to create a post API, which is going to be auth/register, and then create an async function. We call it register user, for example, and then access to the body of the request with the body, the creator, and let's call it the create user DTO, and then it's going to be create user DTO class, which we have defined in the previous video. And then inside the body of the register user function, we call the user service.create function. So in order to do that, we have to inject the user service inside the auth controller. So we're going to have private user service, which is going to be type of user service class. And now we can access to the user service class. We just return await this user service create function, and then pass the create user DTO to it. So if I go to the create user DTO class, you can see that our DTO or our body request should have a name, email, and also a password. So let's close this off and let's save the auth controller. And then since we have used the user service inside the auth controller, we have to register the user service as a provider inside the auth module. So we just add the user service here, and now we are good to go to run our server. So before running our server, let's run our Docker Compose file, and now the Postgres container is running, so we can go ahead and run our server. So here we have an error. Let's see what is it. And it says that the user repository is used inside the auth module. So here we go to the auth module, and inside the imports list we say type ORM module, and then call the for feature function, and then pass a list, and we say we want to use the user repository inside this module. And let's save this, and yeah, the error is gone. And let's open up the Insomnia and let's make it a little bigger. Okay, here as you can see, we have a post request to the /auth/register, and then pass the name of the user, which is test user, the email of the user, testuser@somewhere.com, and the password 123. And if I click on the send, you can see that it creates a user for us with the name of test user, email testuser@somewhere.com, and also ID of 6. So we can use the email of this user as a username, and then 123 for its password in the login API. So I go to the login API. Here, as you can see, we have a post request to /auth/login, and the username will be test user, and the password is 123. So let's pass a wrong password here and see what's happened here. So you can see that it returns to us a unauthorized 401 error. And if I correct the user, which is 123, and send the post request, it gives us an internal server error. So I go back to the VS Code and see what is the error. So it says that secret or private key must have the value. So I go to the auth module here, and here we have the secret inside the JWT module. So it has a weird error. We just have to put it inside the backtext and then interpolate the process.env.jwt secret. And if I save this and go back to Insomnia and again send our login request, again it gives us an internal server error. So I go back to VS Code. It has a secret or private key error. We have set the secret key option and read it from the env file. So I go to the env file. It has the same spelling. Go back to the auth module, and here we register the JWT module. And yeah, here we have registered the JWT service as a provider. So we'll remove this. And as you can see, the JWT module and JWT service are from the same package. And since we registered the JWT module inside the import section of the auth module, we shouldn't include the JWT service inside the providers of the auth module. So let's save this to see if it solves the error or not. So if I click on the send, and yeah, it returns an object that contains the ID of the user, the name of the user, email, and most importantly, This is the access token of the user. So now we can protect some of our API endpoints and require the user to have this access token inside the header of its request. So if the user doesn't have the access token inside the header of its request, or have a wrong access token, we can verify the access token and then reject the request of the user. And if the user has the correct access token inside its header request, we can allow the user to call that API. So up to this point of this video, we have successfully implemented the local strategy of our passport authentication system, which means that we can allow a user to log in into our system with a username and password. And now we can go ahead and implement the JWT strategy of our passport authentication, which means that we can allow a user to call an API route if it has the access token inside the header of its request. So again, a local strategy means that the user can log in into our system with a username and password. But the JWT strategy means that the user can call an API if it has a correct access token inside the header of its request. So with the JWT strategy, we can authenticate a user with an access token. So let's go ahead and implement the JWT strategy for our Nest.js application. Okay, go back to the VS Code. And here inside the strategies directory, I'm going to create another file called JWT-strategy.ts. And then inside it, we're going to export a class named JWT Strategy, and then extend it from the class that passport strategy function returns. So it's a function that returns a class, and inside this function, we should pass the strategy that we want to use. So here we want to use the strategy from the passport-JWT, but as you remember, inside the local strategy, we pass the strategy that comes from the passport-local. So here in the JWT strategy, we pass the strategy that comes from the passport-JWT. So don't confuse these two strategy classes. They have the same name, but come from different packages. Okay, and as a second parameter of this passport strategy, we can pass a name for our strategy, which is optional. So when we use the strategy from the passport JWT, the default name for the strategy would be JWT. But if we want to create more than one strategy from this passport-JWT, we should specify a different name for these two strategies. And since we are going to create another strategy named refresh token strategy from this passport-JWT strategy, here I'm going to specify a name for this JWT strategy. So I'm going to go ahead and specify the JWT for the name of this JWT strategy. And then we're going to create the body of the class, and inside it, we're going to create our constructor. And in the constructor, we call the superclass. And inside it, we're going to pass an option object, and the first property would be JWT from request, and then set it to extract JWT, and then call the function from auth header as bear token. So this extract JWT comes from the passport-JWT, and then set the ignore expiration to false. And then we should provide our JWT secret. So I'm going to say secret or key and set it to process.env.jwt secret. So this is the same secret key that we have used in order to sign the JWT access tokens. So with these three functions, first of all, we specified that the access token is inside the authorization header of the incoming request. And here we specify that if the access token has been expired, then reject the request. And as the third option, we provide the same JWT secret that we have used to sign the JWT access tokens. And after the constructor function, we're going to define a validate function. So I'm going to say async validate, which takes the payload, which is type any, and then just return an object with the user, which is going to be payload.sub, and also username, which is going to be payload.username. So what is this payload parameter? It is the payload object that here we have used in order to sign the JWT token. So after a request comes to our JWT protected API endpoint, the JWT strategy first of all extract the access token from the header of that request and then decode the payload object from the access token with this secret key and then pass it to this validate function. So we return the user, which is the payload.sub, because here we set this user object, which has the name inside it, into the sub object of the payload, and then the username is the payload.username. So if I go back to the payload object, you can see that it has a username, which is the user.email, and a sub object, which is our user object with just a name property. So here inside the JWT strategy, we do the reverse thing for the payload object. We just extract the user from the payload.sub and the username from the payload.username. So that's it for the JWT strategy, and now we can go ahead and create our JWT guard. So I go to the guard directory and create a file named jwt-auth.guard.ts, and inside we're going to export a class named JWT guard, which extends the class that returns by the auth guard function, which comes from the Nest.js/password, and then we specify the name of our strategy. So it would be the JWT, because in our JWT strategy, we set the name of JWT strategy to just JWT. So I go back to the JWT guard and leave the body of the class just empty, and then we just have to mark it with the injectable decorator that comes from the Nest.js/common. So that's it for our JWT guard, and the last thing we should do is to go to the auth module, and inside the providers we add the JWT strategy. And that's it, and we can now go to our API routes and decorate them with the JWT guard. So for example, if I go to the user module, here inside the user controller, I go to this route, which is /user/ID of the user and then /comments. So we can now decorate it with the JWT guard. So I'm going to use the use guard decorator, and inside it we're going to pass the JWT guard, and that's it. So now let me go to Insomnia in order to test this API route, and here I go to the user comment, which inside it we have a get request to the /user ID of 1 and then /comment. So if I click on the send, we got an unauthorized error message. And if I go back to the VS Code and remove this JWT guard from the /ID/comments of the user controller, and now let's save this and go back to the Insomnia, and now if I send this get request to the /user/ID/comment, we can see that this route returns the response for us. So now if I go back to the Insomnia and then uncomment the use guard and save this, and then send the request again, we got an unauthorized message again. And that's because we have to have an access token inside the header of our request. So first of all, I'm going to log in. Here I'm going to log in again, and this is the access token of the user. I just copy that and then go to the user comment, and inside the header of this request, I'm going to specify a authorization. And then the value of the authorization would be the bearer string, which it has to be there, and then a blank space, and then we paste the access token that we've got from the login request. So now if I click on the send, it returns us the response from the API. But if we tamper with the access token, for example, let's remove the last character of the authorization header and then click on the send, you can see we get an unauthorized message again, and that's because our access token is no longer valid. So if I fix this and again click on the send, you can see the response is returned to the user, and that's because now our access token is valid. So in this way we can easily protect our API routes with the JWT guard. So let me quickly recap what we have done in this section. First of all, we create the JWT strategy, which inside it we have exported a class named JWT strategy, and then it extends the returned class from the passport strategy. And inside this passport strategy function, we pass the strategy that comes from the passport-JWT. And then we set the name of the JWT for this JWT strategy. And here we pass the option that says the access token is inside the authorization header of the request. And then we set the ignore expiration to false. And then we provide the same JWT secret key that we use to create our access token. And then we create the validate function, which decomposes the payload object. And then we have created the JWT guard, we just extend the auth guard and then pass the string that specifies the name of our strategy, which is just JWT. And that's it. And as a last thing, we go to the auth module, and inside the providers, we register our JWT strategy. And that's it. And now we can go ahead and go to our controllers and protect our API routes with JWT guard. So in this case, every route with the JWT guard decorator is protected, and the incoming request to this API route should have a valid access token inside the authorization header of the request. So that's it. We can easily protect our API routes with JWT guard from Passport JWT. And as a last section of this tutorial, I'm going to create a refresh token strategy. So what is the refresh token strategy? If I go to the auth module, you can see that we configure the JWT module, and in the sign-in option, we set the expire time to 1 hour, which is 3600 seconds. So in the real-world application, we usually set the expiration time of the access token to just 4 or 5 minutes. And after the 5 minutes, the access token is expired. So when the user wants to access a protected route after the 5 minutes, its request will be rejected with unauthorized message because the access token is now expired. So the user have to log in again and get a new access token in order to access the API. So this is a really bad experience for the user. So we have to have a mechanism to refresh token when the access token is expired. So in order to do that, we go to the auth.service file, and here inside the login function, in addition to access token, we provide a refresh token as well. So I'm going to provide a refresh token here and set it to this.jwt service and call the sign function to create a new JWT and pass the payload. And as a second option and as a second parameter, we pass the option object, and then we specify the expires in property and set it to, for example, 7 days. So the refresh token will be expired in 7 days and access token will be expired in 1 hour. So let me go to the auth module and set the default expiration time to just 1 minute 60 seconds. So let me go back to the login function. Again, our access token will be expired within the default expiration time, which is 60 seconds, and the refresh token will be expired within the 7 days. And now we should create a API in the auth controller for refreshing the token. So the user send its refresh token inside the body of the request and get a new access token. So as the name implies, it refresh its token. So before creating these API routes, let me create the refresh token strategy and refresh token guards. So as before, we go to the strategies directory and create a new file called refresh token.strategy.ts. And this refresh token strategy would be almost the same as the JWT strategy. So just copy the code inside the JWT strategy and go to the refresh token strategy file and paste them here. So the first step is to rename the strategy. So I want to say refresh JWT strategy, and the strategy here would be the same as the JWT strategy. But in order to distinguish between these two strategies, JWT and refresh JWT strategy, we should provide a different name for them. So the JWT strategy, the name was JWT. But here inside the refresh JWT strategy, we're going to go ahead with the JWT-refresh. So in this way, we can distinguish between two strategies that are extended from passport-JWT strategy. And then inside the constructor, And the option object that is passed to the super function, we set the JWT from request to extract JWT dot from body field, and then name of the field inside the body of the request that the refresh token should be existed. So in this case, we're going to pass the refresh. So the refresh token inside the request that is coming to the refresh token API should have a body, and inside the body of the request, we should have a refresh property which contains our refresh token. And then the rest of the refresh JWT strategy is the same as the JWT strategy. So we save this, and now we can go ahead and create our refresh JWT guard. So inside the guard directory, I'm going to create a file named refresh-jwt-auth.ts. So the refresh guard is as the same as the JWT guard. So I go to the JWT guard and copy the code inside it. And here I'm going to paste it inside the refresh token auth guard. And just rename the name of the guard to refresh JWT guard, and then since here inside the refresh token strategy we pass the name of the refresh JWT strategy to JWT-refresh, just copy the name here, and here inside the refresh guard we pass the JWT refresh as the name of the refresh auth guard. So let's save this and go to the auth controller and create a refresh token API. So here I'm going to create a post request and then set it to refresh. So the route our API would be /auth, then /refresh, and then create an async function and we call it refresh token. And the parameter of this refresh token would be the same as the login. So here we extract the request with the @request decorator from the Nest.js, and then here we return the this.auth service.refresh token, and then we pass the rec.user. So obviously we haven't created the refresh token inside the auth service. So let's go to the auth service and create a refresh token function. So it would be almost the same as the login. So let's copy that and paste it, rename it to refresh token. It takes the user as username, create a payload object, and then here instead of returning the user data, access token, and refresh token, we just return a object that only contains the new access token. So let's save this and go back to our auth controller, and here decorate the refresh API with the use guards, and then pass the refresh JWT guard. And as the last step, we should register our refresh JWT strategy inside the providers of the auth module. So now we have the refresh API, we have the /auth/refresh API for refreshing our tokens. So now let me go to Insomnia to test the refresh token API, and here we send the login request with this username and password, and you can see now we have a refresh token as well as the access token. So I copy the access token and go to the protected route, which is the user comments, and inside the header we paste our access token, and if I click on that you can see that we have the response from this API. So I'm going to pause the video and wait for 60 seconds and then send the request again. Okay, I have waited for 60 seconds now, and let's send the request again. And you can see that we've got an unauthorized error message, and that's because after 60 seconds, the access token will be expired. So we have to refresh our access token using this refresh token that we've got from the login API. So I copy the refresh token and go to the /auth/refresh API, and inside the body of the request, we set the refresh to the refresh token that we've got from the login API. So if I click on the send, you can see that we have a new access token here as a response of this request. So I copy the new access token and go to the user comment, go to the header, and replace the access token with the new one and send the request. And you can see now the response is returned to the user without any error. So yeah, that's it for the refresh token section. And let me quickly recap what just we have done. So I go back to the VS Code. Step 1, we create a refresh token strategy. And here inside the option of the strategy, we said that we are going to expect the refresh token for the body field of the request, and the name of the property inside the body that contains the refresh token is refresh. And then we define the refresh JWT guard that extend the auth guard with the name of JWT-refresh. And this JWT-refresh comes from the refresh token strategy. And here we specify the name of the strategy to the JWT-refresh. And then we go to the auth module and register our refresh JWT strategy. And here we, inside the auth service, we have created a refresh token, which create a payload from the user object, and then return a new access token with the JWT service and return it to the controller. And here inside the auth controller, we have created a refresh token API, a post request, and then mark it with the use guards, and then pass the refresh JWT guard, so it expects the incoming request to this post refresh API to have a body inside it, and inside the body it expects a refresh property which contains the refresh token. So if the refresh token is valid, it calls the auth service refresh token, and as I say, it just create a new access token for us and return it to the user. And that's it for the refresh access token. It is very simple with Nest.js and Passport. So yeah, I think that's it, enough for the authentication with Nest.js and Passport. And in the next video, in the Nest.js playlist, I'm going to come up with a comprehensive tutorial for the TypeORM that covers everything you need to know to master the TypeORM. So stay tuned for my next video, and if this video was useful for you, please hit the like button because that will encourage me to move forward. So stay tuned for my next video and have a nice time. Bye bye.